Hey, everybody. I think we're about to get started. So, thank you for joining us. We are so excited that we're having this fantastic conversation. It seems to be the perfect time about the one big, beautiful bill here in the United States. And I know we've got several members from across the world, but also here in the United States represented. So, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking a few minutes. We've got a fantastic expert panel who's just going to give you all the answers, or at least we'll try. So really appreciate you taking the time. So I wanted to introduce myself and my co-moderators for this fantastic discussion. I'm Angela Barranco, Executive Director of Climate Group North America. I will pass it to our fantastic chairman, Governor Bill Ritter.
Yeah, I'm Bill Ritter, former governor of Colorado. Ran an energy policy think tank for about 14 years and am chair of the board of Climate Group North America. Sam?
Hi, Sam Kimmins, Director of Energy with the Climate Group. And just to really kick this off, I wanted to give some context of why this is so impactful and important for RE100 members, SEBA members, etc. Speaking from the RE100 point of view, RE100 brings together over 440 global corporations committed to using 100% renewable electricity, with total demand greater than that of Texas or the ERCOT region, representing billions of dollars of investment in energy infrastructure. So historically, the US has been one of the easiest places to source 100% renewables, and that's been a strong attraction for our members, strong attraction for investment, and only around a fifth of our members are headquartered in the US, but 2/3 have operations in the US. So this is very important. Any changes to that market are very important for the members, whether in Korea, Japan, etc., who have operations in the US. Core to RE100's role is to assist policymakers in opening up and improving markets for corporate buyers. So we're having great success in the EU, Korea, Japan, China, South Africa, and India, among others, working with our policy working groups and trusted local partners. Now, in the USA, we direct our members to SEBA for their deep in-country expertise and high-quality policy work. So thank you to SEBA Chief Exec Rich Powell for joining us to give more information on the bill and its implications for corporate buyers. So without much ado, I shall hand over to you, Rich.
Rich, thanks
Good
for joining
morning.
us.
Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. And what timing on arranging this, Angela? This is and Sam and Bill. This is amazing.
Absolutely. And breaking news all over the place, Rich. I mean, I think if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of just the top lines. Like, what happened overnight? What should we be looking at? What matters today?
Well, first, I hope everyone will apologize. This bill went through the entire evening, and so I've had more sleep than I had last night. So hopefully this will be comprehensible. And we've got amazing folks coming on next that I think are already very deep into it, and will do, I'm sure, a better job than I will in sort of in the summary here. Just so folks that have not been closely following this process understand, we're now to the moment where the second U.S. chamber, the Senate, has now, as of this morning, passed the reconciliation bill. It was a 50-50 vote, and so Vice President Vance had to come and break the tie to get this across. So now both chambers have voted on a version of this bill. Where our system works is now it will go back to the House. The House is under intense pressure to pass this bill very quickly by July 4th. That remains to be seen whether that is possible given the huge amount that is in this piece of legislation and Speaker Johnson's existing commitment earlier to give House members at least 72 hours to look through and read the bill. That would sort of push us, now here on July 1st, that would quickly push us past July 4th and require people to take the vote on July 4th. So we'll see. But I think it's fair to say things are going to move very quickly from here, but they are not done yet. And so there is still some possibility that the bill as it was passed through the Senate can't attract the votes to make it through the House. And so we would have to go back to a conference process where the two chambers come together and negotiate and figure out what the final bill would be that they would both pass. But I think that there will be intense pressure from President Trump, who's now sort of signed off on the Senate bill to pass this. So So that's where we are in the process. In terms of what's in the bill, folks around the world will know that there's been a significant move to limit a number of the clean energy incentives in the bill and to make some significant changes to those. So probably the first thing to report is, and folks may know this, there was a big push to make sure that American taxpayer dollars were not flowing to projects that were owned or controlled by what we say foreign entities of concern. And so that, if I'm direct in the US parlance at the moment, that's primarily Chinese state owned or state controlled companies. There's a concern about the incentives flowing to those. There is still in the bill that passed the Senate a very significant FIAC or foreign entity of concern regime. And so our attorneys and everyone's attorneys are now combing through that to understand how workable that will be. But just know that there will be very significant restrictions on the use of these credits in projects that are, let's say, deeply enmeshed, particularly in the Chinese supply chain. And so that obviously primarily impacts battery technologies and some parts of the solar supply chain. So that's thing one to know. Thing two to know is that a previous version of this bill, which many folks may have read about over the past week, included a new measure which would go past the length of the credits and would say that any project, regardless of whether they take incentives from the bill, would actually have to pay a special tax on the portion of their supply chain that came from foreign entities of concern, an excise tax. So this would be something that was in addition to tariffs. So in some sense, those things would be double taxed, right? They would have to pay a tariff at the border and then a tax to actually operate, regardless of whether they're getting an incentive or not, with an attempt to, again, eliminate these kinds of projects and technologies from the US supply chain. That tax has now been removed. It was sort of very, very roundly criticized by industry, even elements of the White House came out opposed to parts of that tax, and so that I'm happy to say about the bill that has been removed. So there's not a new tax that's been put on new wind and solar projects built in America, or the portion of those that would be FIAC. The last thing I can say about the bill is that there have been strides made in this bill to respect business certainty. I think folks in the Senate heard that the Senate mark that was produced earlier this week actually had retroactive effects. So projects that had already commenced construction, or in the case of SEBA members projects and NRE 100 members projects, where a power purchase agreement had already been signed, but often that happens even before commenced construction. And so there was a significant concern that effectively a whole bunch of projects or a whole bunch of facilities that were placed with the expectation projects would be available, suddenly we're going to have the rug pulled out from under them. And it does appear that significant changes were made in the bill to increase that business certainty and to respect existing contracts. So I think that's a significantly improved measure as well. Obviously, I'm focusing here almost entirely on the clean electricity parts. This is a massive bill and it makes very large changes to many, many other incentives. But I know here with the RE 100 crew, we're primarily focused on the impacts on the wind and solar projects in particular. I'll say one last thing and then I'll stop because I know I'm going on too long already. I think if there's anything that this implies, assuming that this does pass through the House in the next couple of days, it certainly implies a big priority in the US on moving projects much faster. And there's a whole laundry list of additional things that everyone needs to be doing and focused on to get projects through the door and onto grids faster. There are reforms that need to be made down in the regional organizations that control our national power grids. There are reforms that need to be made in federal permitting. There are reforms that need to be made in state level permitting regimes. But the priority for all of those reforms have now really gone up because there's now a much more limited window in order to move these things forward, taking advantage of these incentives. So,
And
sorry,
Rich,
I will pause right there.
if we can talk about that window. So
Yeah.
formerly, the production tax credit, the investment tax credit required you to be under construction in order for you to get the tax credit if it hadn't expired. This tax credit now expires at the end of 2026, or those tax credits, the ITC and the PTC. And I understand that we're back to the sort of under construction, not delivering power to the grid as one of the Senate versions required. Is that right?
It's a complicated regime, Bill, because there's a new structure, and then there are two different carve outs from that structure. So the new structure is that projects have to be, generally speaking, the projects have to be placed in service, not commence construct, but like up and running and operating on the grid by the end of 2027. And the carve out one from that structure is projects that have already commenced constructed, so met the it's not a statutory I'm so glad that we have Ted and Christina on after this, because they could actually walk through all the specifics of this. But the Treasury guidance about what that means, there's a bunch of different tests that you
Yeah.
can do in order to commence construct. But so projects that have already commenced construct are exempted from that, and again, that's sort of in business certainty. And then there's been a further carve out, which is that in a 12-month ongoing basis from the date of enactment of this bill, those projects also, if they commence construct in that window, crucial from our perspective as buyers, and I'm sure crucial for many of the RE100 folks, because you may well have projects that have already signed a power purchase agreement, but for which you haven't yet commenced constructed, but we're expecting to in the next couple of months. Those now appear to also be exempted from the placed in service 27 requirement. So that's a
Thanks.
significant improvement in business certainty. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Rich, I know we only have just like another minute with you, but can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of the feedback you're hearing from member companies? I know that you've been obviously actively talking with folks on the Hill as well. What would be the one big message you would deliver back to companies, but also just to kind of give them a flavor of where the private sector is today on this?
Well, obviously, there remains very significant concern in the U.S. about energy access and affordability and reliability following this. We at SEBA had done an enormous amount of analysis about what would happen if these incentives were removed, especially during a period where demand growth is growing so rapidly. And I'm delighted to say that so many global RE100 members are moving into the US and developing new facilities in the US and buying power here. But that combined with the build out of data centers to support AI, just broader electrification of our industries, really has electricity demand growing here fast again. And obviously that hasn't happened in the US in 20 years. And so expanding our grid is something we're a little bit rusty on. And so we've been very concerned about what all of that would mean if the incentives were rapidly pulled away. So the incentives are being less rapidly pulled away, but pulled away nonetheless. And so I think that there really is now a priority on moving quickly to secure power in all of this, and on us collectively moving forward to a regime. Look, it's very clear the U.S. is moving away from a regime where we're going to permanently incentivize power projects. And so if that is going to be the case, there has to be more work done, again, to reform our permitting systems and move much faster and sort of take off that regulatory drag so that we actually can supply the power that we're going to need to power this electricity hungry economy that we're building here. And so more work has to be done. So I'd encourage people to lean into that, regardless of whether you're headquartered in the US or headquartered around the world. Get active in that conversation about moving power projects faster, about connecting things to grids faster, because that's really now the priority.
Amazing. Thank you, Rich. You've been an incredible expert to us. To folks who've joined us, we have had a great turnout already. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments, send it to us directly. We would love to hit up the Q&A. I know Rich has to run right now, but we'll also be happy to share more information on this channel and potentially, as things develop, be able to continue the conversation here. So thanks so much, Rich, for joining us. We really appreciated the update and just really thankful for you joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see everybody.
Thanks, Rich.
So next up, we have two incredible experts who will be joining us: Christina Costa, a former White House official, and Ted Lee, who served in the Treasury Department on all things tax. I promised them that they could go full wonk on this part of the session, because I think it's really important for us to jump into the details. And I know that folks who've joined us, we've had a lot of comments already with people saying, like, I was looking for information. I had no idea what was going on. I got the news alert. So, Christina, Ted, I want to give you the floor. Give us give us the down low here. What is happening? What should people really be focused on? And I know the process isn't done yet, so there's still a lot more to be done.
Yeah, thanks, Angela, and thanks, Governor Ritter, Sam, and thanks to Rich, who's dropping off, and of course to my dear colleague Ted Lee, who was in the Inflation Reduction Act implementation minds with me over the 2.5 years that we had to implement the law in the previous administration. As Rich said, one of the strengths of the IRA for the investor community in particular, and for the technology community was the long-term certainty that was provided to industries, from power generation, but also to manufacturing, to the production of clean fuels like hydrogen. And it also, I think, a thing that was a little bit underappreciated was that there was an aim to transition these incentives and these policy supports to a technology neutral approach that really offered consistent tax treatment to zero emissions technologies, particularly in the power sector, though not exclusively in the power sector, in ways that were sort of predictable for investors, that offered important financing flexibilities to make sure that basically these projects were as affordable to build as possible, and that we could deploy as much clean energy as possible. Every successive version of this bill, from the initial Ways and Means draft to what passed the House, to what was introduced by the Finance Committee, to what was done by the Budget Committee, to what just passed this morning, has basically exploded that paradigm. And so you are looking at a situation in the United States for investors that is going to be much, much less certain going forward, that is going to be much more complex, that is going to be more costly in terms of the kinds of insurance agreements and tax equity arrangements and transferability deals, and the assurances that partners and projects are going to need to provide to each other. And so, I guess it's going to be a big boon for lawyers and advisory firms who are going to be very, very busy if any version of this becomes law. But it's going to be very complicated for investors and for companies. So briefly, what has been consistent across the bills with some variation is that there's a functionally immediate repeal of tax credits for consumers. Many of which were longstanding, had longstanding bipartisan support in Washington. So tax credits for residential solar and residential energy efficiency projects now go away after the end of this calendar year. So do incentives within 12 months, I believe, incentives for commercial building energy efficiency investments also go away. The most recent version of the bill that passed the Senate has the shortest window yet for repealing incentives for purchases of electric vehicles. Those now go away at the end of the U.S. fiscal year, which is September 30th. And so those are very dramatic changes that I think are going to have a major impact on the consumer market and on manufacturers and companies that offer services in the consumer market in the United States. It's going to take, I think, a long time for those sectors to right size and adjust their practices, because again, these were incentives that weren't invented by the Inflation Reduction Act. They were changed by the Inflation Reduction Act, but they weren't invented by it. The bill that passed the Senate also shortens the duration of the availability for the manufacturing production tax credit. It shortens the duration of availability for the hydrogen production tax credits. And as Rich was saying, in the electricity sector, it creates a very, very sharp cliff for wind and solar investment, and provides sort of a longer window for for other clean electricity sources like geothermal or nuclear. But of course, those take a much longer time to plan, permit, and build than wind and solar do. And so that's why I wanted to note that we'd been trying to take this kind of technology neutral approach to incentivizing investments in zero emissions technologies. And that goes away now under the Senate version. You have just a radically different treatment for wind and solar projects than you do for other clean electricity generating technologies. The thing that I think Ted is going to really dive into, and that I think is really not well understood, and particularly for those companies and investors who may be calling in from overseas or watching this later from overseas, is the enormous thicket of red tape that every version of this bill has introduced, both for manufacturing projects and for clean electricity projects that relate to foreign entities and foreign influenced entities, quote unquote, that are going to be enormously challenging to meet. There are a dozen or so complicated tests related to ownership and foreign influence that apply, I believe, immediately. Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, but immediately upon enactment to all of the electricity credits, to the manufacturing credit, to the carbon capture credit, to the clean to the biofuels credit, that are going to just impose significant burden even on U.S. based taxpayers to certify compliance to the IRS, and those different tests are compounding. You have to kind of understand and deal with all of them, and they have, in many instances, sort of complicated interrelationships with each other that, again, may be a boon for some law firms trying to untangle all of these things, but are not necessarily going to be good for investor certainty or certainly for keeping financing costs low. There are complicated additional rules around new contracts in the power sector and in the manufacturing sector that really risk, again, entangling companies going forward after enactment of the bill in ways that I think may or may not be entirely intended, but do impose just much greater burdens on auditing and on certification to these sectors that don't apply anywhere else in the US economy. And then there are additional supply chain, or what the bill calls material assistance rules, on the electricity and the manufacturing credits that take effect after the end of this year. And there are some significant ambiguities in the legislation that, in terms of how terms are defined and sort of the level of traceability in the supply chain that will be necessary to meet these rules, that I think, particularly after the end of this year, but even I would say before that, are going to make it more difficult to invest with confidence. And so Ted and I worked very closely on the Inflation Reduction Act foreign entity of concern rules together. Ted also worked on the Chips and Science Act FIOC restrictions. You will hear these called FIOC. You will hear them called foreign entities of concern. It is for those who are familiar with the restrictions from CHIPS or from the original IRA, this is an entirely different animal. And so do not think that what we did in the previous administration is likely to hold for these new rules. But Ted, do you want to dive in a little bit more? And then I know that we want to take some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Christina, and thanks everybody for having us. I think, as Christina mentioned, this is really an important site of action moving forward, particularly if the bill maintains its current shape, which is this really intense web of compliance issues that might make financing some of these projects really difficult. For those of you who are less familiar, the way that these tax credits are frequently monetized and then used to finance projects is through a series of different transactions, and frequently that's all backstopped by a tax insurance system that essentially says, like, yes, we have a good sense of what the IRS would do if ultimately this type of project were to be audited. I think what's so difficult about this system is that it's so complex and would require so much additional elaboration that it's really hard to say whether or not you're actually going to be in compliance without a lot of analysis and a lot of the different players in that transaction getting really comfortable. As Christina alluded to, there's basically three different parts to this, two of which kick in immediately for the clean electricity and manufacturing credits. The first is what they say is like a specified foreign entity, which essentially is a list of foreign entities of concern, which include things like a set of Chinese battery companies, companies that are terrorist organizations. So that sort of list is relatively easy to determine. But then on top of that, there is a control test as part of that specified foreign entity rule that requires you to have an understanding of the actual ownership structure of a particular entity, which includes looking at, in many cases, individuals and individual nationals, which just makes that it can be a very intensive piece just on its own. Then there's a set of tests around a foreign influenced entity, and that involves a number of different transactions that you might have with a specified foreign entity. So in order to determine whether you are a foreign influenced entity, you need to know who are all of your sort of business counterparties, what sort of contracts are you entering into, and are all of those arrangements, whether they are debt arrangements or particular IP arrangements, are those with somebody who is a specified foreign entity, which again then requires you to understand the details of their ownership structure. So there's a number of rules around that foreign influence entities. And in particular, one thing that I think will be challenging from a financing perspective is that there's also a 10-year clawback of the investment tax credits related to payments that are made to a foreign influence entity that, uh, or sorry, if you are sort of conferring effective control by making payments to a specified foreign entity, thus making you a foreign influence entity, which is going to be a really tough term for a lot of people to swallow, particularly in a lot of these financing transactions. Then on top of that, of both, you have to look at your own ownership, you have to look at your influence, you have to look at the ownership and influence of all of the parties that you are then doing business with, and determine whether or not any of those put you into trouble. There is also this set of material assistance provisions, which essentially says, with an escalating threshold, you have to be able to prove or say with quite a great deal of certainty that you didn't get those um, components or manufactured products or constituent materials that went into your particular facility from a prohibited foreign entity, so from those previous two categories of entities. And that is going to require a very extensive look at supply chains, as well as getting quite a lot of information about the costs of your particular suppliers, their suppliers, and all the way up the chain, which is going to be a lot of detailed and oftentimes competitively sensitive information that will be difficult to get. And so that is sort of the world that we are headed in addition to sort of imposing that material assistance threshold for qualified facilities, so energy producing facilities. There are also additional penalties. It extends the statute of limitations for audits on material assistance from the normal 3 years of audits to up to 6 years. So the IRS has a 6-year period in which they can look back and sort of determine whether or not you violated those rules. The current iteration of the bill also imposes an additional 10% penalty if you were to incorrectly certify your material assistance. So you don't just get the credit clawed back, you would in addition have to pay an additional penalty. So I think that's quite concerning from the perspective of a lot of taxpayers. And you might be asking yourself, okay, well, there's a lot of these new terms, a lot of these new issues that are being introduced. How are we going to be able to sort this out? Is Treasury going to and the IRS going to be able to provide us guidance on all of this? There are a few sort of gestures in the bill to sort of direct Treasury to provide guidance on these issues. I think it's possible that there may be guidance at some point in the future. I think timely, comprehensive guidance that is very thoughtful and fully takes into account the full set of industry concerns is probably a long time coming, just because a few reasons. One being that Treasury and the IRS are going to have a ton of competing priorities. The set of provisions that we're talking about with clean energy here are just a small part of this overall bill, and they're going to have a lot of other work that they're going to need to be sorting through and going to need to prioritize. The second is a real personnel issue. A lot of the people who worked on this, both at the IRS and Treasury, as well as partners at key agencies like the Department of Energy, have left or been affected by the actions of Doge. So there's just fewer personnel with the expertise to really handle these issues. And then I think just lastly, these are just really complicated, complex issues. As Christina alluded to, she and I worked very, very closely and worked very hard where this was one of the very top priorities of the Biden administration. I don't think this will necessarily rise to the top set of priorities for this administration. And as a result, it will just take a long time to work through these issues, particularly given the breadth and sweep of them.
My goodness, guys, that is a lot to digest. I mean, but thank you, because I think this is the level of detail that, because the bill is so large, right? There are so many components to it that it's actually really hard for people. And one thing we've seen in the comments, and I know that Sam has a question from the audience to offer, but it's just hard to wrap your head around all the pieces. Even just the foreign interest piece that you're talking about, right? Like, has so many layers to it. And I think that anyway, I'm really glad this is recorded. I think a lot of people will come back to it and try to really digest it for their own businesses and for their own interests. But Sam, jump in. I know you had a question from the audience that was pressing.
Yeah, this is a question for the audience, but also one that we're being asked by our members on a daily basis. Do we have an indication of overall cost implications and development time implications? I asked that question with a recognition that this is incredibly complex and there may be an impact that we don't understand yet the full implications of. But do we have an indication at this point for wind, solar?
In terms of the cost to develop projects, you mean?
Yeah.
We don't know. So there will be, and it's going to depend on how quickly I think tax insurance providers are able to put together new offerings sort of in this immediate phase, assuming that what passed the Senate this morning becomes law, which of course it may or may not. There's additional steps that the House has to take, and of course the president has to sign the bill before it becomes law. But let's assume for a second that what passed this morning becomes law, and sort of wind and solar developers have this 12-month period where they can commence construction. There's going to be a difference, I think, for them in whether they commence construction in terms of cost between now and the end of the year when these material assistance rules come into effect, and over then the next functionally 6 months, basically, between December 31st and the end of the credit availability in terms of their financing costs. Because again, these material assistance tests are going to introduce greater uncertainty for the insurer, for the tax insurers, for the financial partners. Whether you're claiming the investment tax credit or the production tax credit is also going to now create a difference in your costs because of that recapture rule that Ted was explaining, because the risk of investing potentially in an ITC as opposed to a PTC is now going to be substantially increased. Again, depending on how this recapture rule is ultimately interpreted and enforced. But that 10-year period it's a long time to try to offer financial assurances about a deal. It goes way beyond sort of, it basically doubles the current industry standard, and it was already pretty difficult to find insurance products based on a 5-year recapture. And so I think the speed with which the tax insurance market is able to respond to these changes and offer products is going to make a meaningful difference in the next 12 months in terms of how much investors' costs are going to increase. And then, of course, functionally, when the cliff gets hit 12 months after enactment and you switch to this placed in service phase down, you're looking at you're looking at the loss of a 30% to a 50%, depending on whether you were claiming bonuses, tax credits. So that is just going to be a straight increase in the basis of the cost of a project compared to the current law baseline. So costs are going to go up is the short version. We don't know exactly by how much, because it's going to depend on how the market reacts and how quickly the market is able to react. I don't know, Ted, if there's anything that you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think Christina captured it really well. I do think it's worth noting that some of these compliance costs would come into effect immediately, in the sense that you would need to determine whether or not you as a taxpayer are a specified foreign entity, or if you are a foreign influenced entity, which then requires you to immediately sort of look through all of your sort of debt arrangements and contract and IP arrangements to understand who you're doing business with and whether they are specified foreign entities, right? So that is an immediate impact, right? I think for all projects. And then, as Christina was saying, yes, I think there's a big difference after this year because of those material assistance provisions and the uncertainty created by those
So, Ted,
material
I
assistance
think I'm going
provisions.
to ask the last question, and Angela's going to wrap up. Um, these issues around foreign influence and foreign entities of concern, were they all part of the House package that moved to the Senate, or are some of these kind of redone or brand new from the Senate version?
Yeah, so I'd say the overall structure of these three pieces of this approach of sort of ownership, influence, and material assistance, that sort of overall framework is pretty similar across the two chambers. And I think that's sort of a mainstay of anything we're probably likely to see going forward. I think the difference between the House and the Senate versions is that, particularly on material assistance, the House sort of took a proposal that said if you have any sort of material assistance, then you're out. You can't get the credit. Whereas the Senate version takes a bit of sort of this material assistance threshold. So you would have to calculate exactly how much of your costs are coming from sort of prohibited foreign entities. I think the issue, though, is that if you can't actually calculate that, because one, you're not sure what that calculation is supposed to be. There isn't guidance from Treasury and the IRS. The statute is a little bit ambiguous. It's not really clear how much that helps you, because there's still quite a bit of uncertainty, and therefore going to be a number of costs that get, in many cases, probably passed on to the sponsor, because the insurer won't want to underwrite that, and the buyer is going to be concerned about those tax credits being clawed back.
Well, thanks. Yeah, this is the Full Employment of Lawyers Act, is what it is. I mean, there are gonna be a lot of attorneys that make a lot of money billing hours to people who are trying to understand this bill. But thank you very much, Angela. I'll throw it back to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Ted. I feel like we could have kept chatting with you for an hour or two more, because there's just so much to dive into. I want to encourage everybody, if you have more questions, if you've taken a look at some of this stuff and you want to have more information, drop a note in the comments. We'd be happy to get back to you. If there's a lot of interest, we can always keep the conversation going. Governor Ritter, Sam, thank you also for joining. So I think in terms of like next steps and wrapping, like I think part of this is just sort of understanding a bit like where do we go from here? What do we do now? So Governor Ritter and Sam, I'm just going to throw it to you guys really fast and say, like, I'm an RM100 member. I'm a person on this uh, LinkedIn Live. What can I do next? What are recommendations? What's the next step here for you?
Well, just from a domestic perspective, Angela, this is not done. It is, it's going to go to conference. It's kind of why I asked the question about these different matters and were they in the House version, because anything that's different in the two versions becomes part of a conference committee. And in that conference committee, there will be members of the House representing the House, members of the Senate representing the Senate, and they have to ultimately get to a bill that aligns before it can go to the president. And a bill which then is voted again by both the House and the Senate and passes. And so procedurally, we still have a bit of a ways to go. We'll see how quickly they move that along. But for anybody that might have, members of the Senate or members of the House who are involved in that, I think it's just good to stay in contact with them and express both, you know, concern, and if you maybe even express appreciation about the ways in which the bill changed, where it was improved upon from a clean energy perspective. So thanks, Angela.
And I think echoing what Bill says there, if you are an RE100 member who, particularly an international member who is making investments in the US, and you're currently having conversations with local representatives about those investments, and you're concerned about the impact of that bill, of the bill, have the conversation with the local congressperson or senator, so they really understand your concerns and how this may impact in your decisions to invest.
No, great points, Bill and Sam. And I'll put a plug in just for RE100. This is a great network. Stay in touch. Let us know what these impacts are. If you're US based or US operations are having impacts, just relay those back to us. We're going to be sending out a poll survey to all members so that you can help stay in touch with us, give us some data. And as Sam and as Bill and as Christina and as Ted said, now's the time to get engaged and really understand what this is going to mean for your business, for your operations here in the US. So with that, I will close us. Thank you for joining us. We've had amazing attendance throughout this conversation. This will also be recorded. So for folks who couldn't join us, thank you for joining us via recorded LinkedIn Live. And we're going to keep this conversation going. We know how important it is for all of you. So with that, go off and have a wonderful rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning. And we will talk to you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Angela.